All right, so today we're diving headfirst into ancient Rome. And you've brought us La Repubblica Romana for this deep dive.
Right.
And I've got to say, just the fact you were working from a Spanish text this time around adds a whole other layer of intrigue to this.
Yeah, it's amazing how a different language can really just make history come alive in a whole new way.
Totally. And especially with something like the Roman Republic, right? I mean, talk about a period packed with legendary figures, epic power struggles, those massive battles. It's all there. And of course, it sets the stage for the Roman Empire that we all know.
Right.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's rewind all the way back to the beginning.
Okay.
The source you've brought in starts with the Etruscans, and I gotta say, they're kind of like a historical puzzle box, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. And the source really leans into that sense of mystery right from the get-go. There's this big debate about their origins. Were they from Asia? Were they these incredible traders who just traveled so much that it seems like they were from everywhere?
Or is there something else entirely that we've just completely missed?
Yeah, exactly. It really is like trying to piece together this ancient puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
It's like trying to solve a riddle from centuries ago, and then on top of all that, you've got their language. The fact that we still haven't fully deciphered Etruscan writing just blows my mind.
I know.
It's incredible. We're talking about a language that was spoken for ages. They left all these tantalizing clues, and we're still sitting here trying to crack the code.
Yeah, it really highlights just how much we still don't know about the past, you know? But even with these linguistic mysteries that we haven't quite figured out, we still get these really interesting glimpses into their world.
Okay, so what do we know about them?
Well, your source highlights their surprisingly advanced engineering skills.
Okay.
They built well-planned cities, impressive temples, and get this, they were using arches in their construction.
Wow, really?
Which, at that time, even the Greeks hadn't fully mastered.
Talk about being ahead of the curve. It makes you wonder what other kind of innovations they might have had that we just don't know about.
Exactly. And here's something that I found really fascinating from the text, especially in the context of the ancient world at that time. The source points out that women held a position of considerable prestige in Etruscan society.
Oh, wow.
Which was pretty uncommon back then.
Really uncommon.
And it really suggests that they might have had a much more progressive social structure than many other civilizations at the time.
That's a really fascinating detail and definitely challenges our preconceived notions about what life was like back then.
Definitely.
Now, let's talk about Rome's legendary beginnings.
Okay.
The source kicks things off with the tale of Aeneas and Dido, which right away kind of hints at that whole future rivalry between Rome and Carthage. Talk about foreshadowing.
It's true. Myths and legends, they often hold a lot more than just these fantastical stories, right? They often reflect a culture's values, their fears, their aspirations. The story of Aeneas, this Trojan prince, and his, shall we say, ill-fated love affair with Dido, the queen of Carthage. It's a perfect example of this. It's this really powerful story about love, betrayal, destiny. And it really sets the stage for this clash between these two emerging powers.
And the timeline that the source lays out for all of this is just wild.
It is.
It compares it to saying, like, imagine if Columbus met Queen Victoria.
That's a good one. Yeah.
We're talking about the Trojan War happening somewhere around 1200 BC, and then Carthage being founded centuries later.
Right.
It just boggles the mind to think about how those events get woven into Rome's origin story.
It really shows the power of myth-making when it comes to shaping a shared identity for a whole civilization.
And speaking of mind-boggling, we can't forget about Romulus and Remus.
Of course not. The classic tale.
Abandoned as babies, rescued by a she-wolf, which, by the way, the Romans absolutely loved because it played right into their self-image as this fierce and powerful people.
Ah, yeah, they love that.
And then ultimately, these two brothers are destined to found the city of Rome.
What a story.
I mean, it's one of those stories that just seems almost too incredible to be true.
Right.
But it became a cornerstone of Roman identity.
It did, and they even used it as the starting point for their entire calendar.
Exactly. Ab Urbe Condita, or AUC.
There you go.
Which means, from the founding of the city, they dated everything back to this legendary event in 753 BC.
It's fascinating how their entire sense of time was anchored to this one legendary moment.
Right.
It really goes to show you just how important origin stories are, even if they're more myth than actual historical fact.
Totally. And speaking of these pivotal moments, the source transitions from these legendary beginnings to the very real reigns of the seven kings of Rome.
Right.
each one kind of leaving their mark on the city's development in their own way.
Each one adding their own chapter to the story.
We've got Numa Pompilio, who is credited with establishing Roman religion.
A pretty significant contribution.
Hugely influential, even to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Tarquinius Priscus, who brought in some of those Etruscan customs that we were just talking about. And get this, he built the Circus Maximus.
I love that detail.
Oh, I can only imagine what it must have been like to witness those chariot races.
Oh, the spectacle of it all.
And you know what I think is really interesting is how your source doesn't just focus on these individual kings, but it also highlights these elements of Roman culture and ritual that start to kind of solidify during this time.
It does. Like, for example, it mentions the Roman triumph.
Oh, right.
This big public celebration for a returning general after a victory, complete with a parade of captured prisoners.
Oh, yeah. A very in-your-face display of power and victory.
It was meant to demonstrate the might of Rome.
And, of course, that's something that would become even more elaborate and grandiose during the Roman Empire.
Oh, absolutely. They took it to a whole other level.
But before we get there, we have to talk about Tarquinius Superbus.
Oh, yes, Tarquin the Proud, as he's not so fondly remembered.
Yeah, not exactly known for his humility.
Not at all.
The source tells this really interesting story about Tarquin and the Sibyl of Cumae.
Oh, I love that story.
So this Sibyl, she offers Tarquin 9 books of prophecy.
9 books? Can you imagine? Talk about a valuable commodity.
Right, like having a crystal ball to the future.
Exactly, but she offered them at an outrageous price.
Okay, and so what happened? Did he just refuse?
He did. He balked at the price. And here's the thing. Every time he refused, she would burn 3 of the books.
Oh, no.
Burn them right in front of him, but the price stayed the same. I mean, honestly, who wouldn't have caved after the first 3 went up in smoke?
Right. Like, at that point, you're just throwing away destiny.
Exactly. But that was Tarquin for you. It's a story that really captures that Roman fascination with fate, with destiny, with this idea of knowing what the future holds.
Trying to control their own destinies.
In a way, yes. But as we often see with those who let pride guide them, Tarquin's arrogance ultimately leads to his downfall.
And that downfall was ultimately sparked by a truly horrific event. The rape of Lucretia.
It's a pivotal moment, as the source explains, because this act of violence ignites a rebellion that ends up with Tarquin being overthrown.
And this is where things get really interesting, because it marks the end of the monarchy and paves the way for... Drumroll, please.
I can practically hear the trumpets.
The Roman Republic is born.
And with it, a whole new set of challenges and opportunities.
This is where we move from a system with a single ruler to a system of government that, at least in theory, is supposed to be about the people.
In theory, yes. But as we're about to see, the road to a truly representative government in Rome was paved with, let's just say, a few bumps along the way. And, you know, this new era, it wasn't all smooth sailing right off the bat.
Right. New systems always come with some growing pains.
Exactly. And the source does a really great job of digging into the power dynamics of this early republic.
Okay.
Especially that stark contrast between the patricians and the plebeians.
Right. You've got this rigid social hierarchy.
Yeah, where the patricians basically held all the cards, right?
The elite families, they had all the power.
All the power. And then you have the plebeians, the everyday Romans.
The common people.
And they were often drowning in debt, stuck with these unfair laws, lacking any real political voice.
It's a recipe for trouble, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And what's amazing is how the source captures just how tense things got. The plebeians basically said, enough is enough.
I mean, can you blame them?
No. They were fed up, so they decided to take matters into their own hands.
What did they do?
They seceded from Rome.
Wow, they just walked out.
They packed up and formed their own settlement nearby.
That's a power move right there. Talk about making a statement.
It really shows just how deeply they valued things like fairness and representation, even way back then.
They were willing to walk away from everything to fight for their rights.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that throughout history, people have always been willing to stand up for what they believe in.
So this act of defiance, it leads to the creation of a new political figure.
Yeah.
The tribune, right?
Exactly. The tribunes were a game changer.
Okay, so tell me more about these tribunes. What was their role in all of this?
Well, they were elected solely by the plebeians to represent their needs and protect their interests.
So they were like the voice of the people.
Exactly. Think of them as a check on the power of the patricians. They even had the power to veto laws they thought were unfair to the plebeians.
That's amazing. It's like they created a system of checks and balances within their own government.
Exactly. It was a huge step towards creating a more balanced power structure in Rome.
It's amazing how they were able to negotiate that kind of compromise.
And the story of Coriolanus really brings this whole struggle to life.
Okay, who was Coriolanus?
He was this Roman general, a war hero, who actually sided with the patricians.
Really?
Yeah. He almost destroyed Rome because he was so power-hungry.
Oh, wow.
It was only when his own mother pleaded with him that he finally backed down.
So family won out in the end.
It did. And the source uses this story to really highlight these complex ideas of loyalty, ambition, family ties, things that were so central to Roman society.
It's amazing how some things never really change, do they?
That's history for you.
Speaking of history, let's talk about Rome's rise to power. Let's do it.
The source you brought in does a fantastic job of charting Rome's expansion.
It's a fascinating story full of wars and conquests.
It really makes you think about how they went from this small city-state to this massive empire.
Right. It's important to remember that Rome's rise to power, it wasn't some overnight thing.
Right, it was a process.
It was gradual, marked by strategic victories and, but let's be honest, a bit of luck along the way.
And I imagine a healthy dose of ruthlessness when necessary.
Oh, absolutely. They were fierce warriors and cunning strategists.
So were there any specific conflicts that were particularly important during this period of expansion?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Samnite Wars, for example, were absolutely crucial.
Okay, tell me about those.
Well, Samnites, they really forced the Romans to rethink their entire military strategy.
Up until that point, the Romans were really reliant on the legion.
That was their main fighting force, right?
Exactly. But the legions, they were these massive formations.
So not exactly known for their agility.
Not at all. And the Samnites were fighting on their home turf, hilly terrain where those big, slow legions just couldn't maneuver effectively.
So what did the Romans do?
Well, this is where you really see that Roman adaptability come into play.
They were known for being quick on their feet.
Exactly. They developed something called the manipular system, which basically meant breaking down those huge legions into smaller, more mobile units.
So they could adapt to the changing battlefield conditions.
Exactly. It was a total game changer for the Roman military.
It's incredible how these challenges often force us to innovate and adapt.
Absolutely. And speaking of innovation, we can't forget about the Roman road system.
The roads.
Yeah. Your source makes a really good point about how those roads were more than just a way to get from point A to point B.
Okay, how so?
They were a symbol of Roman power. These roads connected their vast and expanding empire, and they allowed for the swift movement of legions and trade goods and information.
It was like their circulatory system.
Exactly. It helped keep the empire connected and functioning.
It's amazing to think about the impact that infrastructure has had even to this day.
It's a legacy that's still felt centuries later.
But you know, as we all know, Rome's rise to power wasn't without its setbacks and challenges.
No empire is built without overcoming obstacles, right?
Oh, no.
Right, so you've got this brilliant military mind, but even Hannibal couldn't completely overcome the logistical realities of the situation.
Ah, so even the best strategies can be hampered by practical concerns.
Exactly. Like, the source points out that even though Hannibal was winning these big victories, he was often deep in enemy territory.
Far from home in those supply lines.
Exactly. And meanwhile, back in Rome, well, they're fighting a defensive war, right? Closer to their home turf, which meant they could replenish their troops and resources much more easily.
So it becomes a battle of attrition in a way.
In a way, yes. And you know, on top of those logistical challenges, the source really emphasizes this incredible resilience of the Roman spirit.
That's something you see again and again in their history, right?
Oh, absolutely. They were known for their discipline, their determination, their unwavering belief in their cause. And you know what? Even after devastating losses like Cannae, they just refused to give up.
That's incredible. It speaks to some kind of deeper strength, doesn't it?
It does. It shows the power of a shared identity, a common purpose. The Romans, they believed they were destined for greatness.
And that belief fueled their actions.
Absolutely. They were willing to fight tooth and nail to achieve that greatness.
So these early conflicts, these victories that allowed Rome to become this dominant power, they also kind of set the stage for some pretty big changes within Roman society itself, right?
They did. And, you know, the source makes this really interesting point about how Rome's victories abroad actually ended up planting the seeds for the Republic's eventual decline.
Okay, how so? What do you mean by that?
Well, it all comes down to the consequences of expansion. Constant warfare led to this massive influx of slaves taken from conquered territories.
Which I imagine had a pretty profound impact on their society.
It did. In the short term, sure, it boosted the autonomy. But it also created some serious social problems.
Right, because if you have all this readily available cheap labor, it's going to have ripple effects throughout the entire system.
Exactly. The source talks about how small farmers, for example, they really struggled to compete with the wealthy landowners who could exploit this huge, inexpensive labor force.
It upsets the whole balance.
It does. And what made things even worse was that it led to a decline in the traditional Roman citizen soldier class.
Who were really the backbone of the Roman army.
Exactly. And as if that wasn't enough, you also have this growing, increasingly restless population of unemployed people in Rome itself.
That like all these ingredients for instability are starting to mix together.
Right. You've got this perfect storm brewing, social unrest, economic inequality, and this weakening of those traditional values that had always been so central to Roman identity.
And as all of this is happening, I imagine it creates opportunities for ambitious individuals to exploit the situation, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the source actually uses this really interesting phrase, panem et circenses, which basically translates to bread and circuses.
Right. Keep the masses happy and distracted with free food and entertainment.
Exactly. It was a way of maintaining peace, but it didn't really address any of the underlying problems.
It's a tactic that's as old as time itself.
It really makes you wonder if those in power ever really learn from the past, doesn't it?
That is the question. And speaking of learning from the past, I'm thinking about the story of the Gracchi brothers.
Oh, yes. A classic example of the challenges of reform when you're up against deeply entrenched power.
It's one of those stories that's both tragic and inspiring at the same time.
I agree. You've got these two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who genuinely wanted to make Rome a more just and equitable society.
They saw these problems, these injustices, and they wanted to fix them.
They did. They really did. They pushed for land reform, for policies that would help the poor, but ultimately their efforts cost them their lives.
It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of a more just society often comes at a steep price.
It does. And as Rome was dealing with all of this internal turmoil, well, you also had the rise of these incredibly powerful generals whose ambitions would further weaken the foundations of the Republic.
Right, like Marius and Sulla.
Exactly. They were both celebrated military leaders, but their rivalry, the civil war they waged against each other, it left Rome deeply divided and vulnerable.
It's almost as if the very institutions that had made Rome strong, the military, the political system, were now being used to tear it apart.
It's a classic example of how unchecked ambition and the pursuit of power can ultimately undermine even the most successful civilizations. And, this all brings us to perhaps the most pivotal figure in the late Republic, Julius Caesar.
Caesar, a name that's practically synonymous with ambition, strategy, and ultimately tragedy.
Exactly. And the source paints this fascinating portrait of him as this incredibly complex figure, a brilliant military mind, a gifted writer, a charismatic leader who truly captivated the Roman people.
He was larger than life in many ways.
He really was, and his conquest of Gaul, which he, of course, documented himself, it made him wildly popular with the Roman people. But his growing power and influence, well, it also made him a target.
He was walking a dangerous line, wasn't he? Challenging the status quo, but also becoming increasingly isolated from the very system he was a part of.
He was, and it all culminated in one of the most shocking events in Roman history, Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March.
It was an attempt to save the Republic, but instead it really just ended up dooming it.
Right, because Caesar's death created this power vacuum that plunged Rome into yet another round of civil wars.
This time between Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, and Octavian, his adopted son and heir.
Exactly. And as we all know, it was Octavian who came out on top. He defeated Antony and Cleopatra, which brought an end to the Roman Republic once and for all.
And with that victory, Octavian, who would later become known as Augustus, becomes Rome's first emperor, and we enter a whole new chapter, the Roman Empire.
It's remarkable to think that this whole saga, from those early days with the Etruscans to the rise of Augustus, it all unfolded in just a few centuries.
It really makes you appreciate just how quickly things can change, doesn't it?
It does, and it's a powerful reminder that history isn't this straight line from point A to point B.
Yeah.
It's messy, it's unpredictable, it's full of these unexpected twists and turns.
And at the heart of it all are these incredible individuals, these larger-than-life figures who are driven by ambition, by ideals, by this relentless pursuit of power.
And that's what makes studying this period so fascinating, right? By diving into these pivotal events, getting to know these figures, we gain a deeper understanding of the forces that have shaped the world as we know it.
It's like we're piecing together this giant puzzle, and with each new piece, we gain a little bit more clarity, a little bit more understanding.
Exactly. And as you continue exploring history, remember to ask those what-if questions. What if things had gone differently? What if certain decisions hadn't been made? Could the outcome have been different?
It's all about perspective, about examining the past from different angles, and you never know, we might just find some valuable insights into our own lives and our own world today.
Exactly. The past is never truly past, is it? It's always there, informing the present, challenging us to learn from the triumphs and tragedies of those who came before us.